Here in the U.S., President Trump says he's considering invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy troops to the U.S. cities after courts blocked his National Guard deployments. The 1807 law gives presidents emergency powers to use military force on American soil. Mr. Trump describes Portland as experiencing what he calls, quote, criminal insurrection.
Well, good morning once again. This is Stuart Ryan with the Ryan Report. You know, I hear a lot of mainstream legacy and social media reporting, analysis, and advice on substantial political and legal issues that is complete bullshit. Superficial analysis, beside the point, a waste of energy, and never offering a possible solution. The most immediate existential threat to American democracy, or rather, what remains of it, is the Trump regime's attempt to use military force against U.S. citizens in our cities and states as a means to consolidate totalitarian power. So the very first thing on a proper agenda to repudiate this Nazi campaign is to define the methods being used and to find solutions wherever they may appear, be that through legal actions or through popular universal protests and interactions. Pundits who neglect to explain the operational legal concepts involved here are remiss in their duties and obligations to the American people and do us a great disservice. It may seem to you, and I hope it doesn't, dry and academic for me to attempt to explicate on the relevant laws, but I am foolish enough to believe and expect that you will follow my lead because, simply put, knowledge is power and ignorance is certainly not bliss. Bearing in mind events over this past weekend highlighted by the power-crazed emperor with no clothes on, sending federalized National Guard troops into Portland, Oregon, being met with real resistance by both the Oregon governor, Kotek, I think that's correct, and by Gavin Newsom in California. Judge Immergut in the federal district court, a Trump appointee, mind you, has delivered a scathing rebuke of the Trump syndicate for their attempts to create fear and chaos in the streets of an ordinary city within which normal local law enforcement deal quite capably with their sworn duties. She has ordered a TRO, a temporary restraining order, to prevent any such troop deployments from either state units, depending on a hearing and discovery, and has indicated her view that such troop deployments are inherently and fundamentally unconstitutional. So let's get to the underlying law or laws that Trump is using to rationalize his takeover of our American cities, and I'll leave aside the whys for the time being. As he did in California, and was soundly rejected by the trial court's Judge Stephen Breyer in Newsom versus Trump, he has been using 10 U.S.C. 12406, and I assume he has once more gone to the same legal well. Here is 10 U.S.C. 12406. He has not yet attempted to utilize the Insurrection Act of 1807, and then it's 1878, and so on and so forth. But should he fail to prevail in Oregon on 12406, he will absolutely turn to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807 and has already indicated that possibility. So what is the Insurrection Act? The Insurrection Act of 1807 is the U.S. federal law that empowers the President of the United States to nationally deploy the U.S. military and to federalize the National Guard units of the individual states in specific circumstances, such as the suppression of civil disorder, of insurrection, and of armed rebellion against the federal government of the United States. The Insurrection Act provides a statutory exception, or I would say possible exception, to the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 that limits the president's deploying the U.S. military to enforce either civil law or criminal law within the United States. Now, there is a tension here. After invoking and before exercising the powers authorized under the Insurrection Act, now under Title 10 U.S.C. Section 254, requires the publication of a presidential proclamation whereby the U.S. President formally orders the dispersion of the peoples committing civil unrest or armed rebellion. The Defense Department guidelines defined, this is quote unquote, Homeland Defense as a constitutional exception to the restrictions of the Posse Comitatus Act. Therefore, the political, military, and police measures necessary to protect national security from external threats are exceptions to the restrictions of the Act. But importantly, bear in mind, this has not been fully litigated except for the fact that the Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown versus the Board of Education was enforced through an exception to the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which allows the president to use these federal troops for domestic law enforcement. This came to a head during the 1957 Little Rock crisis when President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard to enforce school desegregation against the orders of the state's governor. Now, the United States Constitution does not explicitly grant the power to declare martial law, but historically, both the President and Congress have played roles in its imposition. Congress has the authority to pass legislation authorizing the use of martial law. The Supreme Court has suggested that any substitution of civilian courts with military tribunals by the federal government must be authorized by Congress and can only happen in wartime. Now, as to the president, he has acted as commander-in-chief to deploy military forces domestically, an authority outlined in the Insurrection Act of 1807. Legal scholars, however, largely believe that the president cannot unilaterally declare martial law in a way that displaces civilian government because doing so would conflict with the Posse Comitatus Act and other laws passed by Congress. You can see there is an enormous tension here. So, getting to the means of fighting back against the Trump totalitarian regime relies a great deal on the courts in our judicial system governors in blue states, which are the most threatened, must unite like Newsom and Kotek and ban into a network of resistance. Every governor must refuse to allow Trump to deploy troops of whatever declination into their cities or any of their cities of their compatriots. Further, it would appear that governors have the right themselves to declare martial law, and I would expect and recommend them to take this course if absolutely necessary and if under direct threat of the Insurrection Act being invoked by Trump. It is quite interesting that state-level declarations of martial law are more common and have been upheld by the Supreme Court. I don't know the case law on it, but the constitutions of nearly all states permit the governor or state legislature to declare martial law in an emergency. State declarations of martial law and the actions taken under them are still subject to federal constitutional limits and, obviously, judicial review in a federal court. Now, the key restrictions on martial law is that American courts have established important limitations on the use of martial law to protect civil liberties. State and federal declarations are subject, as I've said, to judicial review, allowing the courts to determine if the declaration is constitutional. Martial law is not permitted where civilian courts are open and functioning, and I think this goes back to Ex parte Milligan in 1864 or 1865. The Supreme Court has also ruled that civilians cannot be tried in military tribunals as long as civilian courts are operational, going back to Ex parte Milligan, or is it Merriman? I don't know. The federal government remains bound by the Constitution even under martial law and cannot violate citizens' constitutional rights. I'm exhausted. That is enough for today, but I would appreciate it if any of you who see this, watch this through to the end, which may be even fewer, I suspect, than those subscribed. I'd be thrilled if you left serious comments, analysis, criticisms. I don't mind them. I expect them. Give me a thumbs up. Give me a like. Give me some help here. Let me defeat this gargantuan shadow blocking that I face through this very mysterious algorithm. God bless. Thank you.